From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Library's Center for the Book, which is the reading promotion arm of the library. And we have many different ways of promoting books, reading, literacy in libraries. Here at the Library of Congress, we're pleased to host Books and Beyond Talks. Thank you for joining us today. We also have networks of state-affiliated centers around the country that work with us. We have reading promotion partners, including the National Newspaper Foundation, which is a partner of ours, and to express sort of our concern about reading in newspapers. And indirectly, our speaker today, of course, is promoting not only the importance of newspapers, but their vital role in our society, for better or for worse, or when mistakes happen, or even when something isn't true. We're going to learn more about that. The Center for the Book also plays a key role in the National Book Festival, which has just had its 10th year here at the Library of Congress. We have a date for next year, which is September 24th, which I hope you will remember, and we're looking forward to continuing that wonderful kind of book and reading promotion. These programs are really videotape for the Center for the Book's website. And the Books and Beyond, I did a little count the other day on our new website, which is read.gov. I hope you take a look. We have almost 160 of these talks which are available, including an earlier talk by Joe Campbell on his book 1897, which was a wonderful book. The website is, in addition to what we have available from the National Book Festival, over 600 talks are available on the National Book Festival website. So I'd like you to think of the Library of Congress increasingly as a resource for getting snapshots of current American literature and American writing. Because it's being videotaped, I do ask you to turn off all things electronic. The plan for today is for our speaker to make a presentation, of course, and also to have a chance to speak with the audience. There'll be questions and answers, and if you are part of that conversation, you are giving us your permission, thank you very much, to be part of a future webcast. You'll be one of the 160, or by then 170 webcasts. The Center for the Books and Beyond programs are also on Facebook. You can learn about future programs, learn about past programs, make comments, and I invite you to do that as well. An important part of the program is at the end we'll have a book signing. You'll have a chance to talk more with our speaker. Another important part of this is the co-sponsorship for every one of our Books and Beyond programs, and I'm really very pleased that today's speaker and today's program is co-sponsored by the Center for the Book and the library's Serial and Government Publications Division. And to introduce our speaker, I am pleased to present Mark Sweeney, the chief of the division. Mark, let's give Mark a hand.
Dr. Campbell has received awards for both research and teaching. In 2006, the American University Student Government chose him as the AU Faculty Member of the Year Award recipient in recognition of his advocacy for students. The following year, he won AU's Morton Bender Prize, which recognizes scholarly achievements by an associate professor. He more recently was recognized nationally by Kappa Tau Alpha, the Journalism Honor Society, with the Taft Outstanding Advisor Award. Dr. Campbell's research has won national awards from the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication and the American Journalism Historians Association. His 2001 book, Yellow Journalism, Puncturing the Myths, Defining the Legacies, challenged the myths of the late 19th century yellow press period. In 2006, he published the first-year study in journalism research The Year That Defined American Journalism, 1897 and the Clash of Paradigms. His writings have been called lively and fascinating, beautifully written, and thoroughly researched. His latest book is a critical examination of the news media, debunking prominent media-driven myths. In Getting It Wrong, Dr. Campbell uses meticulous research to reinterpret the evidence behind such iconic stories as hysteria about Orson Welles' War of the Worlds, the Katrina reporting, and Watergate. He casts a critical eye on each of the stories, offers timely lessons to historians and journalists alike, engages skepticism in a thought-provoking way. So please welcome Dr. Campbell. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, for those very kind words, and John Cole, thank you too. It is a real pleasure to be here this afternoon with everyone. It's a special occasion at a special place for me. I have done a great deal of research over the years at the Library of Congress, and I want to thank again John Cole, Mark Sweeney, as well as Terry Sierra, who's here, Travis Wesley, and Georgia Higley, who've been very, very helpful, been very accommodating, very courteous in the years of my research here. The Library of Congress is a special place, as I say. I'm particularly grateful, too, to the staff of the library for the courtesy, hospitality, and guidance that they have shown the hundreds of my students whom I've brought to the Library of Congress, particularly to the newspaper and current periodical reading room, to help them thread the microfilm, to get going on major research projects. So this is a special occasion, a special day. Thank you again for the invitation. It's great to be back. I like to sometimes begin my talks by answering the questions that you all may have on your minds at the outset. So let me just give you those answers right away. 6, 7, yes, 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 yes. There you have it. I'm 6'7". Sure you're wondering, how tall is he anyway? Yes, I used to play basketball. And yes, I was pretty good. I mean, at least I played 1 year in Europe in the 2nd division of the Swiss National League. So I was, I guess by Swiss standards, not too bad. Yes, I'm the tallest faculty member at the American University here in Washington, D.C. And yes, it's a pleasure to be here today to talk with you about my latest book, Getting It Wrong, which addresses and debunks 10 prominent media-driven myths. And as John Cole mentioned, I do like to have interaction with the audience. So this is not going to be strict lecture. There's going to be opportunity throughout and at the end for questions that you may have, comments, suggestions for a sequel. I may do another book about media-driven myths if there are enough of those out there remaining. And I think there are. I think there are. So my talk today is going to focus on 3 of the 10 myths addressed and debunked in Getting It Wrong. 2 of them have a pretty strong Washington connection, and 1 of them has a seasonal overtone to it, a seasonal theme. And people who hear about the book, Getting It Wrong, the 10 of the greatest misreported stories in American journalism, think, and often have asked me, wow, that's really a media-bashing book, isn't it? You really take the media to task, don't you? And I like to think, well, maybe, but I like to think of the book as more of a book aligned with the fundamental objective of American journalism. That is to get it right, to get the story right. So rather than a media-bashing book, it's one that tries to do what the media try to do fundamentally, to get it right, to set the record straight to the extent that we can. So what are we talking about here? Media-driven myths are prominent stories. These are not the run-of-the-mill errors that news organizations inevitably will make in the course of gathering and publishing and broadcasting and posting the news. These are prominent stories about and or by the news media that are widely believed and often retold, but which under close inspection, under scrutiny, dissolve as wildly exaggerated or apocryphal, media-driven myths. The first of the three that I'll talk about today is what I call the heroic journalist myth of Watergate. The notion, excuse me, that the investigative reporting by the Washington Post brought down Richard Nixon's presidency, that exposed the corruption, the scandalous conduct, the felonious conduct of Richard Nixon and his men, forcing the president ultimately to resign his office. It was the first time in American history in which a sitting American president, of course, had to resign because of his misconduct. And the notion goes that Woodward and Bernstein were at the centerpiece, at the decisive forces and factors in uncovering the scandal that brought down Nixon's presidency. But I write and argue in Getting It Wrong that this heroic journalist interpretation of Watergate minimizes the far more decisive forces and factors that ultimately uncovered Nixon's guilty conduct and led to his resignation. Those forces and factors were many. After all, this was a scandal of great dimension, great sweep, great intricacy. About 20 men associated with Richard Nixon's presidential re-election campaign in 1972 or with his administration in the White House ultimately went to jail for their crimes that they committed. To uncover a scandal, to roll up a scandal of such dimension, of such depth, of such intricacy, required the collective, if not always the coordinated forces, of a variety of federal investigators. You had the FBI, you had federal prosecutors, you had special federal prosecutors, both houses of Congress, panels from both houses of Congress, bipartisan panels that investigated the Watergate scandal, and ultimately the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court argued that and ruled that Richard Nixon had to disclose, to give up the secret audio tapes that he had made of most of his conversations in the Oval Office of the White House. And those recordings, those conversations clearly showed that Richard Nixon had a guilty role in organizing and ordering the cover-up of the Watergate break-in, the seminal crime of the Watergate scandal. He did so in the days immediately after the break-in of Democratic National Headquarters at the Watergate complex. Had it not been for the tape recordings, had it not been for the Supreme Court's unanimous decision to order Nixon to give up those tapes as evidence to the federal prosecutors investigating the Watergate crimes, is my contention that Richard Nixon probably would have served out his second term. He would have been a wounded president, he would have been a beleaguered president, but he probably would have served out his term, his second term. So the decisive forces and factors in uncovering the Watergate scandal and bringing Nixon down were not the Washington Post. It was not the news media. It was this combination of federal forces and actors and investigators through their collective efforts brought down his corrupt presidency. And it's a funny thing about media-driven myths that often the principles involved deny that they had much of a role in whatever story, in whatever scandal that they supposedly uncovered. And so it goes with the Washington Post. Principals at the Washington Post have often dismissed the notion that their newspaper was a decisive factor in bringing Richard Nixon down. And these people included Katharine Graham, who was the publisher of the Post during the Watergate scandal and the years afterwards. And Katharine Graham, at the 25th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, the seminal crime of the Watergate scandal, said in a program at the Newseum that we didn't bring down Richard Nixon's presidency. The forces that brought him down were constitutional. And she's right. Those forces were constitutional. Those forces were a variety of subpoena-wielding investigative authorities. And even Bob Woodward himself has argued that this notion that the press brought Nixon down is incorrect. Maybe in earthier terms, but nonetheless, he has said to say the press brought down Nixon, well, that's just horsebleed. Horsebleed. Moving on. The next media myth that I'd like to discuss with you is the so-called Cronkite moment. The so-called Cronkite moment of 1968, when Walter Cronkite, the CBS News anchorman, offered a dire assessment about the U.S. military situation in Vietnam. At the end of a special broadcast, at the end of February 1968, Cronkite said the U.S. military effort is mired in stalemate, and he suggested that negotiations might ultimately be the way out of Vietnam for the United States. Supposedly at the White House, Lyndon Johnson is watching the show, is watching the Cronkite special report on Vietnam. And when Cronkite intones this pessimistic assessment about being mired in stalemate at the end of his show, Johnson supposedly leans over and snaps off the television set and says to an aide or aides something to the effect of, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America. Of course, there are lots of versions of what Johnson supposedly said. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America is probably the best known, but he's also supposedly said at that occasion, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the war. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the American people. If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America. Well, that's the end of the war. And unaccountably and inexplicably, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the Midwest. Nonetheless, these variety of versions of what the president supposedly said in reaction to Cronkite's dire assessment about being mired in stalemate is a marker of a media-driven myth. This version variability, the story isn't a straight story, people can't get it straight, is a marker of a media-driven myth. It's a tip-off that this is almost certainly a media-driven myth. Another way to address this story, fairly simple and straightforward, is to ask the question, okay, where was Johnson that night? Presidents leave a lot of traces. It's not difficult to find out where they were on a particular day, even many years later. Lyndon Johnson did not see the show when it aired on February 27th, 1968. Lyndon Johnson was not at the White House. He was not in front of a television set. He was in Austin, Texas. He was on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin, attending the 51st birthday party of a longtime political ally, Governor John Connally. Johnson is shown here at the podium, and Connally is to his left, the birthday boy. And at the moment that Cronkite is intoning the mired in stalemate comment, and suggesting that the United States begin negotiations as a way out of Vietnam, Johnson isn't bemoaning his fate. He's saying, oh my God, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the war, or whatever he supposedly said. What Johnson said was, today you are 51, John. That is the magic number every man in politics prays for. A simple majority. This probably isn't the best presidential joke ever told, but for Lyndon Johnson, it wasn't bad. And it's certainly a far cry from his saying, oh my God, you know, I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the war, or whatever he supposedly said. Even if Johnson saw the Cronkite program later on videotape, and there was a crude, by our standards, a very primitive videotaping machine at the White House at the time, even if Johnson saw this show on videotape later, it represented no epiphany for him. It wasn't like an aha moment, a moment of brilliant clarity, of sudden insight. It wasn't that at all. Because in the days and weeks immediately after the Cronkite show at the end of February 1968, Johnson is out on the, making public statements, giving speeches, urging a recommitment. In one occasion, he's pounding the lectern, urging American recommitment to ending the war in Vietnam, to winning the war, to bringing it to a satisfactory conclusion. Johnson remains hawkish about Vietnam in the days and weeks immediately after the Cronkite show. So if he had seen it, even on videotape, it didn't register. It didn't have much of an impact for him. Because, as I say, he's out there urging a recommitment to winning the war in Vietnam. It was no epiphany for the president. And what Cronkite said on that occasion in 1968 was hardly remarkable, scarcely remarkable at all. Just 4 days before the Cronkite show, the Wall Street Journal had an editorial saying that the U.S. war effort in Vietnam may be doomed and that everyone better be prepared for the bitter taste of defeat beyond America's power to prevent. So defeatism, if you will, was in the air in late February 1968, which is just after the surprise Tet Offensive in Vietnam, in which the communist North Vietnamese and their Viet Cong allies had swept across South Vietnam, attacking almost all the major cities and urban areas in South Vietnam. An attack that surprised most of the American news media, if not the political class. And even before this, even before the Wall Street Journal's editorial, 7 months before the Cronkite moment, the New York Times has a front page story which is headlined, "Signs of Stalemate." Signs of Stalemate. That was in August 1967, months before Cronkite is making this characterization about the U.S. military effort being mired in stalemate. Signs of stalemate had been evident months before. What Cronkite said on that show in February '68 was scarcely remarkable, scarcely a watershed. The third of the three myths that I will speak with you about today is the famous myth associated with Orson Welles' 1938 radio dramatization, The War of the Worlds. Orson Welles at the time was 23 years old, a theatrical prodigy whose best work was just ahead of him in the movie Citizen Kane, which he put out in 1941 when he was 26. The War of the Worlds radio dramatization was aired on CBS radio in the 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. time slot on Sunday, October 30th, 1938. It was part of the Mercury Theater on the Air series that Orson Welles starred in and directed. And on this night, he and his merry band, his troupe of Mercury Theater on the Air players, adapted H.G. Wells's science fiction thriller, The War of the Worlds, which told of an invasion of Earth by Martians wielding heat rays and then wiping out the human race, essentially, or trying to. Wells's dramatization was supposedly so realistic and made such effective use of simulated news bulletins and on-the-scene radio newscasts that people by the tens of thousands, if not the hundreds of thousands, were convulsed in panic and swept up in mass hysteria. They took to the streets, they headed for the hills, they set up defenses to prevent the Martians from attacking them. They contemplated suicide. America went nuts that night. So the media myth has it. So the media myth has it. If technology allows, we will listen to just a brief excerpt from The War of the Worlds dramatization.
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmus Farm, Groversville, New Jersey. We now return you to Carl Phillips at Groversville. Ladies and gentlemen, Tryon. Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back to Stonewall at George's Willis Garden. From here, I get a suite of both days. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk, as long as I can speak. More state police will arrive and join them, of course, in front of the ship. I'll straight them. So he just puts the car back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain, hurrying with someone, and quite speed move. I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted. The professor moves around one side, studying the object while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I say now it's a white handkerchief tied to a pole, flag of truce. Those creatures know what that means, what anything means. There's something happening. Jason rising out of the pit. They make out a small beam of light against the mirror. But there, get the flame spraying from the mirror and makes the light to advancing men. Strike them head on. You want to tell you to play. See a point by the bushes behind the damn tank, the automobile, spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right. Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, to the broadcast from Groversville. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity.
This was about 20 or 25 minutes into the War of the Worlds dramatization, the radio show. And it was about this moment when Americans supposedly were pitched into utter panic and mass hysteria. That the Martians had landed, set up these deadly heat rays, and were about to wipe out the human race. After the fact surveys indicated that most listeners, and there were perhaps 6 million or so people who listened to the broadcast that night on CBS radio, most of them, in overwhelming numbers, recognized the show for what it was, a clever radio presentation on the eve of Halloween. There were perhaps 1 million or so people who were frightened, who admitted to be disturbed by what they heard, but that does not rise at all to the level of mass panic and nationwide hysteria. Most people recognized it for what it was. There were many internal clues as well as external clues that they could have, and did in many cases, tap into if they were concerned. One of them was the fact that events on this show moved much too quickly to be real. In less than 30 minutes, the Martians blasted off from their planet, traveled 40 million miles or whatever it is to Earth, landed near Trenton, New Jersey in a little hamlet called Grover's Mill, set up their heat rays, and then began an assault in the direction of New York City, all within 30 minutes. People listening closely to the radio would have picked up on that. Granted, not everybody was listening closely to the radio because they just didn't do it, just as we don't listen closely to television, sometimes just on in the background. Even so, even then, there were clues and evidence that this was not a real show. Some of the timing was off. It was like a few hours in advance. Some of the references were slightly off. The voice of Orson Welles was well known. Mercury Theater on the Air was a regularly scheduled show every Sunday, 8 to 9 p.m. People who tuned into the show would have recognized Welles and his distinctive voice. Just as we often hit the remote control today, changing channels to see what's on, if there's something better on, if there's anything good on, back in the 1930s, American audiences were also changing the channel in what was called dialitis. Dialitis. Moving the radio dial to see if there was a better show on. So they were prone to do this. And if they thought that this was true, the instinct would have been to say, okay, CBS has an invasion of Earth going on. What do other stations have? What does Mutual have, or what does NBC have? Switching the dial, easily done, and they're accustomed to doing so, would have produced no other confirmation for this kind of extraterrestrial event. Moreover, people could have looked at and consulted the newspaper listings, which in 1938 were giving extensive newspaper accounts of what was on the radio that night. And finally, they could have looked outside the window, as many of them did, and found that there was no invasion going on. Lots of people called the authorities that night. Police, fire, newspapers were inundated with calls from people who wondered, what's going on here? How can I help? Wanting confirmation. Some researchers have looked at this call volume, which did spike in most urban American cities and areas that night. Looked at the spike in call volume, said, aha, evidence of panic, evidence of hysteria. People were going out of their minds. I argue that call volume that night is a good example of how rational people were. It's a very rational response to something they're uncertain about. A rational response would be to call the police, fire, newspapers, authorities that you have trust in to get confirmation as to whether the earth is coming to an end or not. This story was a media-driven myth, not only because it was a clever and memorable radio show. Wells did a great job. It was a beautifully done performance. But it also represented for newspapers an opportunity to bash this upstart new medium of radio. Radio wasn't new. It had become a commercial option to newspapers as early as 1920. But by the end of the 1930s, by 1938, radio was an increasingly important source of news, information, and advertising. It was an important rival to newspapers. It was increasingly a competitor to newspapers. And for newspapers, the War of the Worlds program represented a delicious opportunity, an irresistible opportunity to bash radio, to rebuke radio as unreliable, untrustworthy, and immature. Newspapers wouldn't do something like that. This upstart medium, radio, doesn't know what the dangers are of combining news and entertainment, which Orson Welles did in this show. And so for newspapers, it was a great chance to rebuke the upstart medium of radio as untrustworthy, unreliable. And they did so in big time ways. This is a front page of the Chicago Herald-Examiner the day after Orson Welles' War of the Worlds dramatization. Headlines like this were not uncommon across the country on Halloween 1938. Notice the price the newspaper was charging. The unrelieved newspaper commentary about the War of the Worlds program helped to solidify the notion that widespread panic and mass hysteria had seized the country that night in 1938. It helped to solidify the media-driven myth of the War of the Worlds. So we've talked about three of them this afternoon. What accounts for media-driven myths? Why do they take hold? Why are they tenacious? All three that we've looked at today are at least, 35 years old? What accounts for their tenacity? What accounts for their enduring appeal? There are at least several reasons. I'll offer two or three right off the top. One is that these are delicious stories. These are delicious stories, one that you cherish and enjoy retelling, about how people back in the 30s went nuts because of this radio show that was so well done. How Cronkite was able to tell truth to power and alter U.S. policy in a faraway war. Or how the young investigative reporters at the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, guys just barely 30, were able to, through their tireless and fearless investigative reporting, bring down a corrupt presidency. And these are great stories, delicious stories. Stories almost too good not to be true. They also are reductive in the sense that they simplify history. They simplify complex historical events and offer a very easy to remember, if not misleading, interpretation of history. That's the second reason why media myths are so tenacious. A third reason that I would offer is that they tend to be self-flattering for the media. They tend to applaud the news media for great accomplishments, bringing down a corrupt president, forcing a change in the Vietnam policy, telling truth to power. These are great moments, and they place the news media at the heart of American society, at the heart of these decisive occasions in American life. Some of these myths also tell a story about the news media at their worst. The first chapter in Getting It Wrong discusses the famous anecdote about William Randolph Hearst vowing to furnished the war with Spain in 1898, a story that has lived on for more than 100 years as an example of what the news media can be at their worst, their most malignant. They can push the country into a war that it otherwise would not have fought. So these myths can be self-flattering, they can be self-condemning as well for the news media. And finally, a fourth factor that explains the tenacity, at least of some of these myths, is the cinema. I'm a big fan of cinema, but cinema is a way in which people have sort of embedded into their consciousness these stories, these simplified stories about American history. All the President's Men is perhaps the finest movie done about the Watergate scandal. There's another one out there called Dick, which is pretty good. It's a spoof of Nixon and Woodward and Bernstein, kind of funny, but probably not as well known as All the President's Men, which is based on Woodward and Bernstein's book by the same title. And All the President's Men is probably the single most watched film about Watergate. And it leaves no other conclusion. It leads to no other interpretation other than that Woodward and Bernstein were at the center of investigating the scandal, and they, through their work, brought down Richard Nixon's presidency. That is the interpretation that you come away with from watching All the President's Men, which came out in 1976. So those are the four reasons that I believe media myths are so tenacious and so enduring. They're delicious stories, too good almost not to be true. They are also stories that are self-flattering or self-condemning about the news media. The cinema helps to propel and to solidify these stories. And they also are reductive, stories that simplify historical events, complex historical events, and offer a straightforward, if misleading, interpretation that places the media at the center of these stories. I invite your comments, your questions, your suggestions about media-driven myths, or even the media writ large. Sir.
Yeah, Dr. Campbell, going back to Watergate, in your research, could you say that while Woodward and Bernstein didn't bring down the press, their early investigative efforts helped to percolate that keep it in the news cycle, so that it eventually led to a domino effect of more attention and so on?
That's a very good question. That is the interpretation that the Washington Post would.
Would you mind just summarizing it quickly, the question?
Oh, the question? Okay. The question was, did not the investigative reporting of Woodward and Bernstein have a domino effect on the investigation of Watergate? That they kept the story alive, they kept the reality in front of the American audiences and kept the story going. And ultimately, the investigative arms of government took over and did their work. As I say, that is the interpretation the Washington Post would want you to believe. It places them as an agenda-setting force in uncovering Watergate. The Watergate break-in, the seminal crime of Watergate, was in June of 1972 at the Watergate complex here in town. The Washington Post won its Pulitzer Prize for public service reporting for articles it published about Watergate in the summer and fall of 1972, so from June through October of that year. But they weren't alone in that period. They were not alone in reporting about Watergate. The Los Angeles Times was doing some very good reporting, the New York Times as well, and CBS, Walter Cronkite. At the end of October in 1972, had a two-part series about Watergate. The first of which I think took up maybe 15 or 18 minutes of a half-an-hour newscast. It was an extensive television report about Watergate, trying to put this together visually for Americans. George McGovern, the hapless Democratic candidate for president that year, who ran and lost to Richard Nixon in a 49-state landslide, winning only Massachusetts. McGovern was calling attention frequently to the Watergate break-in and tying it to Nixon's presidencies. And this is the kind of thing, and he was identifying them in very striking terms, brown shirt tactics and so forth. akin to what Nixon would do. And it didn't get much traction, but McGovern was out there calling attention to it. In fact, he was getting some criticism for really going way beyond what people knew at the time was going on. But he was out there making a campaign issue out of it. There were also lawsuits that were being brought against the Republican National Committee, or the committee to re-elect the president, once it became known that they had a role in financing the burglars who broke in and were planting listening devices at Democratic National Headquarters. Lawsuits began to uncover some dimensions of this story too. So the Washington Post wasn't alone, and the federal investigation was well underway by the time they began to get much of their reporting out in public. So that investigation would have continued. In fact, Woodward and Bernstein, in many respects, fed off the federal investigation into the Watergate break-in, into the Watergate crimes, and were reporting pieces of what emerged from federal investigators. That would have continued. In fact, it did continue. Woodward and Bernstein did not break the major moments, did not disclose the major moments of the Watergate scandal. The existence of a cover-up, that hush money was being paid to burglars and their families. That was broken by the New York Times in January of 1973. They did not disclose the existence of the White House taping system, which was a key moment in the whole Watergate episode, a key moment in the whole saga, when it made clear that there was evidence that would, one way or another, make it clear whether Richard Nixon knew about this or didn't. And that became the focal point of federal prosecutors and their investigations from the summer of 1973 through the summer of 1974, when Nixon finally did resign. So these key moments in Watergate can't be linked to the Washington Post.
And I guess no movie was made in the Los Angeles Times, or no movie was made in the Supreme Court. You know, the boring parts got left behind, and one of them became our image.
That's right. The point was that no one was making movies about the LA Times work or the New York Times work or the hapless campaign of George McGovern. To their credit, Woodward and Bernstein in the book All the President's Men does refer to other investigators, other journalists, the federal prosecutors and so forth. There's frequent reference in the book to the work of others. So you can read All the President's Men, the book, as a statement of denying the myth of Watergate, denying the heroic journalist myth of Watergate. It's only when the cinematic version comes out in 1976 that really places these guys front and center as the guys who are bringing down Richard Nixon. And there's really, I mean, looking at it fairly and critically, there's just no other interpretation you can bring away from that. Yes, sir.
I'm just wondering about the role of Deep Throat. For a long time, I was wondering if it was truly just an like, I guess they revealed the name, but how much of this role may have been exaggerated?
It's a good question. The question was about the secret Watergate source whom Woodward called Deep Throat. He was a high-level federal official in the FBI, as it turned out, who met periodically with Woodward under often clandestine circumstances, particularly in a garage over in Roslyn, Virginia, where Woodward and Deep Throat would meet in the middle of the night or early in the morning, 2 in the morning or something like that, to discuss the Watergate scandal. Deep Throat was introduced to the American public through the book All the President's Men, and then became a figure in the movie, played by Hal Holbrook, All the President's Men. And Woodward and Bernstein knew, of course, the identity of the source. So did Ben Bradley, the executive editor at the time of the Washington Post, and maybe one other person at the Post. That was about it, 4 people. And they kept that secret for 30 years. And in Washington, D.C., where, disclosing secrets is the coin of the realm, that was just a remarkable feat, a remarkable accomplishment. Plus, they gave the guy this kind of neat name, Deep Throat, mysterious and lurking and knowledgeable. It was also drawn from the name of a pornographic movie that was popular at the time, starring Linda Lovelace, Deep Throat. But anyway, they dubbed him Deep Throat, and the The book came out in June of '74, just as the Watergate scandal was hitting its climax, hitting its peak. And the guessing game began immediately with a Wall Street Journal article that month, 1974. Who's Deep Throat? You know, I mean, and all kinds of candidates were suggested. And that guessing game went on and on and on for 30 years. And it had the effect of keeping Woodward and Bernstein front and center of the Watergate story. Who is this guy? Turned out to be Mark Felt, the number 2 guy at the FBI, former number 2 guy, who had known Woodward earlier. And when he disclosed, his family actually was the one who disclosed that he was Deep Throat. He was in his early 90s, suffering some dementia, I think, and he was not in very good shape by the time his identity became known as having been Deep Throat. But that was 30 years, and there was a 30-year guessing game. It was really like a parlor game in Washington. Who was Deep Throat? And periodically would come up. People would write books about this. Universities in Illinois, I think, had whole classes devoted to going through all the president's men, looking for internal clues, and then deciphering and coming up with a candidate. Pat Buchanan was one name that this class at Illinois came up with. Diane Sawyer was a suspect because she worked for a little while in the Nixon White House as a press person. Henry Kissinger was also named as a likely Deep Throat candidate. Alexander Haig, who was Richard Nixon's chief of staff in the latter days and months of the Watergate scandal. All of these guys, among others, were suspected. Ron Ziegler, the White House press secretary, some people thought that he was actually Deep Throat on the side. This guessing game went on and on and on, and Woodward and Bernstein, to their credit, kept the identity of their secret confidential source just that, secret and confidential, didn't disclose it. And a lot of people thought over the years, it's got to be made up. Since that name hasn't been disclosed, the Deep Throat candidate hasn't come forward, it's got to be a literary device. It's got to be a melange, a composite of different characters that they pulled together in their book and then in the movie. I was one who kind of began to think that. You know, after 25 years, you got to know the name of this guy. And it didn't come out. You know, they wouldn't, and nobody was saying, yes, I'm Deep Throat, and Woodward and Bernstein would confirm that. It was only in 2005 when Mark Felt stepped forward. So I think he was genuinely Deep Throat. There may have been some embellishments. In fact, there were a couple. I think the book says that Deep Throat was a smoker, a heavy smoker, when Felt had actually given up smoking a few years earlier. That may have been a little bit of disinformation that they put in the book to throw people off the track, but I think overall he was a confidential source, certainly high level enough to know the broader scope of the federal investigation. And turns out he was true. People guessed many times that Felt was probably Deep Throat, but he denied it. Said, had I been Deep Throat, I would have done a better job at it. So he was inclined to disabuse people of that. Yes, ma'am.
What was Walter Cronkite's response to his power, or, his name?
You know, that's, oh yes, I'm sorry. What did Cronkite say about this notion of if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America, or whatever? It's interesting. Cronkite, in his autobiography, in his memoirs, and in other occasions, tended to downplay this. He says, you know, what we said that night was akin to the straw on the back of a camel. It wasn't of a crippled camel. It wasn't that decisive. It wasn't that important. Now, whether he's saying this out of self-flattery or not, I'd take him at his word. For many years, he denied that this had much of an effect, that his program on Vietnam had much of an effect on Lyndon Johnson. It was only late in Cronkite's life when he began to embrace this myth, when he began to say, well, yeah, it did have an effect. I didn't know it at the time, but it really did have an effect, apparently. So it's interesting how he sort of morphed from discounting it to embracing it. Yes, sir, in the back.
That's what I don't know. You told me to ascertain very soon, but I'll come up the other side of the topics.
Well, they're right in that book over there.
I'm guessing, wondering one of them, there was a great deal of fascinating misreporting about the Titanic. I wonder if it's one of
Oh, the Titanic is not in getting it wrong, no. But Maybe speak with me afterwards. We could talk about a chapter in a.
About 3 more quick questions.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'd just like to add a footnote on Walter Cronkite. We were just in Austin at the LBJ Library.
Uh-huh.
And there's a Walter Cronkite exhibit, and the Cronkite moment is featured.
I know. It's amazing. The Cronkite. They have a different quote though from the one that's commonly used. But yeah, it's even the library can't say when Johnson saw this tape, if he ever did, and the notion that he said it to his press secretary George Christian is also unclear, because Christian was asked specifically about this, and he could not remember whether Cronkite saw the show, saw it on tape, whether he saw it at all. He was very vague and very evasive. Yeah, I don't understand why they're doing that. Sir?
What about the story that Richard Nixon was watching the evening news and said, if I've lost Cronkite, I might as well resign?
It's a new myth to me. It's a new one. Sir? Go ahead.
You used the words about the newspapers kind of self-effacingly saying they were reliable, trustworthy sources and so forth. And there's a recent counterpoint, which I think was really a low point, and that's all the media frenzy around this Koran burning. And I guess I'm looking for a comment from you about social responsibility in the media and when they should be acting responsibly. I mean, had they not even covered that event, it would have gone away.
Yeah.
It was clearly dangerous, and it was immature, and it was not responsible.
The question had to do with the responsibility, the social responsibility of the news media in covering flagrant and outrageous and egregious plans, as this minister in Florida had to burn a Quran. And this is a weird story. I mean, it sort of took off from almost nowhere. I mean, the guy is like a very obscure minister in Florida somewhere with a very small congregation, and it's strange in this digital environment how stories can become so viral so quickly. And it wasn't the first time that this minister had threatened to set fire to a Quran, but it was the first time that sort of suddenly it got media attention. I think it was tied in with the controversy in Lower Manhattan about building a mosque not far from the ground zero, 9/11 ground zero. And I think because of the linkage of those two, the story took on more power and more influence than it otherwise would have had. But yeah, I mean, some of this stuff is just utterly baffling. I don't think it rises to the level of a media-driven myth. I mean, the guy clearly was going to do it, or at least said he was going to do it. And then there was a lot of media attention to the story, and then he finally backed off and didn't.
I guess my contention, it would have been a non-event, and the media
Yeah.
not jump.
I think that's right. It would have been a non-event had it not been for media coverage. You're absolutely right. Mark, sir.
Just kind of tying into that, you said that the fundamental purpose of American journalism is to get it right, to set the record. Here at the Library of Congress and libraries, we're about collecting the records so that so the future researchers can do the kind of work you do. So here we are, and we're looking at this is the print media for the most part, the broadcast media, and we're faced with all sorts of new media, citizen journalists, participatory journalism. So are we looking out for the same 4 things when we're looking at the news that we're getting from a sort of citizen journalism? Is that what's driving this?
Or in a digital context, I think that news is speedier and circulates more rapidly than ever before. I mean, it's a good example the gentleman mentioned with the reverend who threatened to burn the Quran. I mean, that story took off, went viral in no time. And we see this sort of the viral nature of news in a very rapid and almost, I'm tempted to say, unprecedented kind of way. But I think in the end, consumers are the ones who are going to make the decision as to whether this is important in their lives or not. I mean, there is such a thing as media literacy. There is such a thing as being skeptical and skilled receivers, audiences for the news. In fact, a lot of people just turn off the news these days. I mean, there's a Pew Research study came out in August that found 17% of American adults on a typical day go without the news. And the news, you'd think is all around us. I mean, it's hard to escape. Print, broadcast, audiovisual and online in the social and digital way. It's just inescapable. Yet 17% of Americans do without the news on a typical day. Suppose you could look at it the other way and say 83% get some sort of news, and that's a good thing. But if you're looking at almost 1 in 5 Americans saying, I don't need it, there's a problem there. And I think the news media are not looking at that sort of turned off audience in a serious enough fashion. And that number of going newsless is higher, much higher for age cohorts younger than 30 and younger. About more than 25% of that cohort goes without news on a typical day. Just turn off on it. Thank you.
Joe, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Great job.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, of course, I want to thank Joe for not only talking about myths, but also he moved a little bit into, Mark, into the digital news environment in which we're part. And it's interesting that here at the Library of Congress, we are a multimedia encyclopedia, which takes into account, the environment for the news, and we are the repository, as you point out, the multimedia repository for yesterday's news, as we heard today, and for tomorrow's news as well. And there's also one multimedia part of this that I want to say in the cinema is absolutely authentic, and that is in All the President's Men. You may remember the shot in the main reading room when it comes right back down on our heroic reporters. And so, I don't know, Joe, you may have misinterpreted there.
I love that. I love that scene. I show it to my students. I say, just before going to the Library of Congress, this is where we're going to go.
That's it, and we're the authentic place. So
That's right.
Who knows? So we now have the book signing. The book is on sale for a $5 discount from the usual University of California price. I hope you'll take advantage of this and talk some more with our speaker. And finally, one more round of applause for our speaker, Joe Campbell.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.